Myself and Hopefully You podcast. My name is Tariq, a university student clueless about what I want to do with my life. So, after seeing a career advisor and a therapist, I decided to start a podcast where I interview guests from all around the world and hear more about their stories. And hopefully, by learning more about them, I can learn a bit more about myself too. So if you're clueless about your career prospects, you want to get some advice from some experts, or you just want to listen to a podcast without a load of ads in the middle, then make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss new episodes out every single Sunday, 7 p.m. UK time. Ladies and gentlemen, this week I sit with a licensed mental health expert and relationship guru who has accumulated over 250,000 followers on TikTok. We discuss topics such as the reason why you might be depressed, the dangers of self-diagnosing, spotting red flags in your relationships, the impact of parent wounds, advice to young adults, and so much more. So, without further ado, my guest at this time, it's TJ from Rugged Counselling. So, TJ, I want to start off with some quick fire questions just to get to know you a bit more. The first quick fire question I want to ask you is, who in your life would you consider as a role model?
Wow, I have so many role models. I'd say, first of all, my dad. I was very blessed to have an involved dad his dad was not around, so he was able to reverse that trend and be around for me. My grandfather, I got to be on a ranch with him growing up and learning how to take care of farm animals and the value of hard work and kind of the old school style of life. Jim Mankey is a guy that he's probably the first one that was my role model for counseling. He was my counselor in high school, and I just saw the impact that he was able to have both on me and both with all the other students as well. So yeah, those are the three that come to mind, but man, there are tons more that I could go on and on about.
Yeah, a lot of people usually have sort of separate ones. We'll get more into sort of your relationship with your dad and even the counselor as well. Yeah. My second one to you is, if there was a house fire and everyone survived, but you could only save one thing. Now, you've got your phone and your laptop because everyone has their phone and your laptop, and I'll let you have your mic as well because that's important. But what would be the thing that you save?
Man, let me think for a second. I'm not big on material stuff, so nothing is coming to mind right off the bat, but I'm trying to think of what's the most kind of emotionally connected. Well, first of all, are we looking for an object or an animal? Because I have a dog. So
no, all animals are safe.
Okay, all animals are safe. Right. So I think I'll go with a blanket that my mom gave me when I was a kid that I've held on to for all these years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So something that's like that. That's a unique answer. I've never had an answer like that before.
Yeah.
Normally people go like photo albums or paintings or things like that. Yeah, no, that's quite cool. It's quite interesting you say that. I've actually got one from years ago now. Someone gave it to my mum, and then my mum gave it to me. So yeah, and it's actually on my bed just over there, to be honest. It's still there. It's a solid blanket. It's lasted me many, many years. So I want to sort of start this podcast off with just asking you, could you just introduce yourself, TJ, to the audience?
Sure, yeah. So I'm TJ Tucker. I'm a therapist. I love being able to help people. Therapy is not the only thing I do in life, but it's kind of the main thing I do sort of on social media. In fact, before I got on social media, or before I sort of started this whole rugged counseling adventure, I didn't even get on social media much. I definitely didn't post much. So getting into this world has been really fun and just a new challenge for me. But even before all that, I've always loved to just get to know people, go deep with them, hear their story. I love to think of life as a story that we're all playing a role in. And then, of course, each person's life is a story. So for me, being able to listen, being able to hear trends in other people's stories also helps me with understanding myself and my own story as well. So I love to be physically active, all kinds of different exercise and watching sports, playing sports. Love music. I live in the southern part of the U.S., so I'm a country music fan by basically osmosis. So yeah, those are a few things. But tell you whatever else you want to know as well.
Yeah, I mean, uh, so you spoke about sort of how you counseling is sort of the main thing you do on social media. Um, oh, and I believe you're a licensed mental health expert. Is that the correct word?
That's correct.
Um,
So in the U.S., we call it a licensed professional counselor or a licensed mental health therapist. Those terms are kind of interchangeable.
so does that mean that you sit down with people and when they ever want to talk, like is that what we're on, or what you do? Yeah.
That's it. And it doesn't, see, I always tell people it doesn't actually have to be sitting face to face, because a lot of guys just don't want to do that. So
Mm.
therapy can look a whole lot of different ways. In fact, I actually prefer to go walking with the person that I'm actually doing therapy with, because a lot of times, for guys at least, the movement, it kind of opens up the communication part of our brain. When we're sitting still, we're less likely to talk, but when we're moving, like we move our hands while we're talking, or if we're walking, for whatever reason, that part of the brain gets sort of activated and we talk more. So yeah, the most sort of typical way to do counseling is face to face, but I like to do it whether it's taking a walk or playing catch, or playing frisbee golf, that kind of stuff, just to kind of get out of the mold. I tend to break the stereotypical mold of what therapy looks like.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting you say that, because there's a new sort of series on YouTube that some of my friends have started. It's called Walk and Talk series, where they basically get different people on and they just walk on some beautiful sort of scenery and have a chat. And from those videos that I've watched so far, you can definitely tell that people are a lot more open. You know, like you said, they're using their arms more, they're emphasizing things more. It's a lot more emotional as well. And so it's interesting to see that yourself, someone that is, fully licensed, is also doing it and believes that sort of it that helps, being outside walking or playing catch or just doing something else. Yeah, and like you said, there is sort of, a lot of, particularly men, don't enjoy just. I don't think men enjoy the fact that they have to sit down and have a conversation. It's almost like an appointment.
Right.
Whilst if you're having a chat and you're walking, you're automatically, oh, it's just a mate I'm having a conversation with, and
Exactly.
you become a lot sort of more comfortable. I want to ask you more about, sort of, at the beginning you said you had a counselor and he was one of your heroes at the beginning. So you yourself, did you personally have some sort of, if you don't want to get into it, that's perfectly fine, but did you yourself have some sort of, did you struggle mentally, what that was like?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I fully believe that everybody should go to counseling therapy. I'm using those terms interchangeably, but so yeah, I was both blessed and cursed early on, realizing that, oh yeah, I need to go, soon. I probably realized that I needed to in middle school, but I didn't go until high school. And at the root of it was insecurity. And people talk a lot about, oh, I'd love to go back to high school and live all those years over again. I'm thinking, no, you have totally forgotten what high school is all about. So, the insecurity, the wondering what other people are thinking about me, and like having to manage this false identity. And now, of course, nowadays the current students are having to manage not only their in-person identity but their social media identity. Like, no, high school, I would never go back and do that again. But thankfully, yeah, Jim Mankey was the counselor there at my school, and he was just, I don't know, he had a truly like angelic presence. Everybody just gravitated to him because he was warm, he was very accepting and loving, and people just knew that they were safe around him. So no matter if he was busy or talking to other people, he always made everybody feel special. Even with multiple people wanting his time, he made each individual feel special. So knowing that, I felt pretty comfortable going to him and saying, like, all right, hey, so for me, the impetus for counseling was my group of friends basically kicked me out of the group in around ninth grade. And so that threw me for a loop, because in middle school and high school, your friends are like the main source of stability, foundation, all that.
How old are
And
you at this? Because we don't use middle school and high school, so
oh,
how old are
sorry,
you?
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. So that would be about 14, 15 years
Oh,
old.
okay, yeah. So definitely, yeah, your friendship group is like the most important thing in the world, isn't it?
Right, absolutely. So yeah, and stop me with terms that I need to, to switch over for you to make sure I'm getting the ages right for you. But I I went to him with that being the kind of the thing I wanted to work on, excuse me, work on. And then I realized, like, okay, yeah, the friend group circumstance was bad, but really it didn't necessarily cause a bunch of issues in me. It just revealed what was already there. And I think that was one of the biggest lessons I learned is that our circumstances, they definitely have an effect on us, but more often they reveal what's already there. So for me, it was I didn't know really who I was. I didn't know um, the type of people that I wanted to be around or that I wanted to be connected to, and I had no idea what my purpose was, and all those kind of those grander sort of existential issues. Those were the things we started diving into. So um, for me, I I tend to gravitate a little more on the anxiety side of things. In other words, I think a lot of times when people struggle, they either tend toward depression or toward anxiety, and I tend more toward anxiety. And so those were the first years I remember feeling those symptoms, and I didn't even know that they had a name called anxiety back then. But looking back, those were the first times I felt those.
In you sort of drew a distinction there between anxiety and depression. Could you just explain those sort of and what the symptoms are for both? Because I think a lot of people sometimes get confused. I know myself, I got confused when I had anxiety or when I was being quite anxious, that I was like, am I depressed? What am I? Am I just sad? Like, what are sort of those symptoms?
Yeah, man, that's a great question because it's so easy to just make a distinguish. Let me try that again. It's so easy to try to distinguish them with words, but with experience, they do feel very similar. In fact, most of the time there is a mixture of both. So uh, the way I kind of frame it with people is that if if you have a quarter, anxiety and depression are basically two sides of the same coin or quarter. So I think a lot of people, they'll start with anxiety and they'll feel that they're very common symptoms like tense muscles, increased heart rate, feeling kind of on edge, or like they always need to be worried about something or need to be running from something, sweaty palms, tight chest. Those are some of the symptoms of anxiety. But when you stay in that physical state for long enough, the body just can't sustain that, and eventually the body just runs out of gas, and then boom, depression hits. And that's not the only time depression hits. Not certainly isn't the only path, but I think that's a pretty common, at least in my experience and the research I read, that's a pretty common pathway. Other times it can be truly purely mixed. So on if somebody has maybe more on the side of depression, it's things like lack of motivation, sleeping a lot, or just feeling like I'm laying down but I can't fall asleep. It can mess with sleep either direction. Losing interest in things that used to give them pleasure or at least some excitement. Um, just general feelings of what's the point? Just that general blah or apathetic attitude. So some of those features are under the umbrella of depression. But yeah, you can have both. I mean, you could go through a day and have 1 hour where you're kind of feeling on edge, anxious, and the next hour it's like, yeah, whatever. So yeah, absolutely, it can be mixed. It's rare that somebody has one or the other without at least a couple of symptoms mixed in.
And can you be sort of diagnosed with these things, with either depression or anxiety or anything else, but sort of have them once and then a few days go by and you don't have them at all, you're completely normal or you completely feel okay, and then again it hits again? Is that a possible thing, or does that mean you're just having bad days rather than having depression and having anxiety?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you go by the DSM, which is the textbook that counselors go by to diagnose, you have to have these symptoms more often than not. Like if you take a 7-day week, you need to be having them probably at least 5 or 6, if not every day. So if it's one of those things where it comes and goes, then it could be more than just having bad days, but it also wouldn't be meeting the level of diagnosis. That doesn't mean that there's nothing going on that needs attention. You definitely need to pay it attention, but in order to earn a diagnosis, it's got to be almost every day.
Yeah, see, the reason why I asked that question is because, and it's hard to sort of explain, but I sometimes feel like there's a lot of either self-diagnosis or being diagnosed by a friend rather than actually being diagnosed by someone who's a professional. And so what tends to happen, what I think happens, and I guess this is more from a sociological perspective, is that you end up, your friend says that, oh, you have bad days or worse than bad days, whatever you want to call it. You tell your friend about it and your friend goes, you're depressed. That they go, or you yourself tell yourself that you're depressed. And I mean, we know, and this is quite, factual, that psychologically, if you start telling yourself one thing, you will start feeling that thing and it will grow into being worse and worse and worse. And
Right.
so sometimes I feel like telling people, or sometimes I feel like saying, it sometimes is mindset, but then other time, if you tell people that it's mindset, then the people who actually are depressed are then going to start not getting the help that they need. So it's sort of a little gray area there of what do you say and what do you not say, and how do you sort of get to the point where you can distinguish? And so the question I want to ask you is that, do you think that is a problem, or am I just sort of being quite judgmental? Is there a problem of people self-diagnosing, and essentially there is kind of more depression cases than there actually are? Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great insight. I tell you, man, because that there's at least 2 levels of this. One level is, yeah, the whole self-diagnosis thing, which is almost always a wrong diagnosis, and then having somebody untrained unofficially diagnose you. That happens so often, and it almost always leads just into more damage, because like you said, if a friend basically pronounces depression over you, then yeah, you probably trust that friend and you trust their opinion, and you start thinking, oh yeah, maybe I am, but I don't know what I'm depressed about. So, oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? And then it just spirals and spirals. And of course, the same kind of inner dialogue happens when we try to diagnose ourselves. Then we go to Dr. Google, so to speak, and try to figure out what symptoms are most common, and we come up with all these crazy possibilities. So yeah, neither one of those are helpful. Then you have people, and I see this a lot, unfortunately, on social media. You have these coaches that are essentially trying to like give out mental health advice, but they don't have any actual training, and that's maybe more dangerous. So yeah, that's a whole concern I have about the process of mental health. And then the level underneath that's concerning is that we get so focused on putting a name on something, putting a label on something. And I think at times that can be helpful. If somebody's really, really in a dark place and just every single day is a battle, but they don't know what's going on, I think putting a name to that can be helpful for them, just to let them know, like, hey, there's a path out of the wilderness for you. But more often than not, it's a situation like you described. It's like, okay, I'm having some bad days in a row, and then a few days go by and it's all good, then it goes back again. That's more common. And so I think in those cases, we don't need to worry about diagnoses and labels as much. In fact, in my private practice, I really, really am very, very slow to talk about diagnoses and labels, because the more we focus on the problem, the more we're going to get of that problem. Whatever we focus on grows. And so if I'm quick to say, okay, yep, it's depression, or yep, it's anxiety, then the tendency is to have the client really focus on, oh my gosh, I have depression, or I have anxiety, or I am depressed, which is the even worse thought to have, because then you're building it in as part of your identity. So I try to bypass the word as much as possible, the label as much as possible, and I try to get to underneath, okay, what are the unmet needs or unresolved conflicts going on under the surface? Because the depression and the anxiety are just symptoms of those unmet needs and unresolved conflicts.
Yeah, see, it's that, I think it's that label, especially, you know, the label of saying that I am depressed. And people don't want that label. Not that there's anything wrong with being depressed. Like, you can always, you know, get help,
Sure.
and get out of that phase. But I think people don't want that label. And by us constantly using that label and just diagnosing everyone as depressed, you end up getting people who genuinely need help not wanting to go for help because they don't want to be labeled as depressed. It's almost seen as like cancer. Like, if you have cancer, then, you know, I don't know what the statistics are, but if you're diagnosed with cancer, you rightly have it's justified for you to feel awful about it, to be scared, to whatever. But
Yeah.
people have now put depression with that as well, and have now basically gone, I don't want to go see a doctor, I don't want to go see a therapist, because what if they label me as depressed? And that's an
Right.
even worse thought for them. So it's, I think that combination is what has, do you think that has almost driven some people to have worse mental health because of all the stigma around, oh, I could be depressed now, so that means I'm not going to go see, you know, a doctor or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it goes into what's called health anxiety, where it's more common where if somebody's feeling some physical pain or discomfort in their body, they're hesitant to go to a doctor because they're afraid of what the diagnosis might be. But yeah, I think it bleeds over into mental health as well, is that I don't want this label. I don't want some burden that is going to be perceived as at least too heavy for me to carry, or like you said, maybe some perceived shame in that, some stigma in that. Yeah, I think that is unfortunately a common thing that holds people back. There are numerous reasons that people don't go to therapy, and that I think is probably one of the, I'd say, top three off the top of my head.
What would you say? I mean, it's interesting that you talk about how it's, you know, probably the top three as to why people don't want to go to therapy. What would you sort of say is, I know you mentioned when you were younger, when you were 14, you had mental health issues. And so we can see there that, you know, mental health isn't this, you know, I know some people, idiots, like to come out and go, oh, the younger generation is just weak and snowflakes and whatever. And you know, they just can't handle it. Has there sort of been, or is there any evidence of, you know, almost mental health practitioners from years and years ago, which would suggest that, oh, wait, no, this generation isn't just a bunch of snowflakes. The only difference is that we're talking about it and you guys didn't.
You know, that I try to wrestle with that in my head. I think anytime there's a blanket statement about a generation that's made, I think number one, that's you can't make blanket statements. But if you actually look into the quote unquote accusation, you can at least find a percentage of people for whom that's actually true. But I think no matter what decade or century you go into, you're going to find people that are pretty tough and can handle hard things because they've handled hard things in the past. And then you're going to find people that can't handle hard things because maybe they haven't been asked to handle hard things in the past. So I don't know that it's, you can't really pin it on each individual within a generation. I think it's a lot of the whole, back to the whole nature nurture thing. I think this particular generation does a great job of talking about mental health in a way that that brings honor to it, that brings understanding, that definitely tears down some stigma. And at the same time, there is so much. Well, I'll put it this way: there is so little downtime for our brains, their brains, whatever generation you want to talk about, because of the phone. For example, I was in the grocery store this morning, and I was sitting there with just downtime, nothing to do, waiting my turn in the line, and I had the urge to reach for my phone because I was bored. I had nothing else to do. But then I had to remind myself, no, I know the science on this. I know that my brain needs rest. So if I pick up my phone, it's just going to keep my brain active and on that treadmill, and eventually it's going to give out. So I just forced myself to sit there and just look around and just take in the sights and the senses and all that. But I think this modern culture we're in, we don't give our brains much downtime, and so I think that does increase some of the mental health struggle. So yeah, that's a really long answer to the question, but bottom line is no, I don't think overall, I don't think it's a lack of toughness. I think it's a lack of really treating our brains and bodies the right way.
Yeah, no, don't worry about sort of long answers. That's what the podcast is all about, I guess. Is
Awesome.
getting as long of an answer. So don't worry about that. You spoke about phones there. You mentioned phones, and obviously we sort of know the impact that phones can have on our mental health. What would you say are the sort of other reasons why there's sort of a growing issue of poor mental health, particularly amongst young people? Yeah, I don't know in America, but in Britain, we're sort of more and more getting cases of really young kids taking their life. You know,
Yeah.
8 years old, 7 years old, which is is just crazy to think about. But it's there and it's happening, and there must be some sort of reasoning behind it.
Yeah, and that it would probably take a panel of experts, medical experts, mental health experts, all that to really get to the excuse me, the root of the issue. But from my perspective, what I notice is that not only do we not give our brains downtime, but we also live at an incredibly fast pace. And on top of that, not only we live at a fast pace and not have any mental downtime, we don't have much physical activity. So if you turn back the clock 100 years ago, or even before that, most of the culture was outside working the farms or doing some sort of labor that involved physical movement the entire day. So they would come home and they would be exhausted, and there was just no energy to spend on kind of what if scenarios like anxiety that our brain tends to try to go to. So not only was the energy already spent, but also since they were active, they were producing a lot of the chemicals that boost our mood and reduce the bad moods. So those are at least two factors, but also if you look, I'm just talking America for a second because I see more of the statistics here than in Europe and other countries, but our wealth, so to speak, quote unquote, has increased decade after decade. Our convenience has increased each decade. Basically, life from the materialism standpoint is really good. But then when you overlay mental health on top of that graph, the mental health struggles have also increased each decade. So I'm no sociologist or philosopher, but part of me sees the trend of, okay, the more we get and the easier things have become, we think that's really going to satisfy us. And it certainly seems like it does on the outside. But when you look at the proof, it's like, oh, wait a minute, maybe these things that we think are supposed to make us happy and satisfy us aren't really the things that we really need at our mental and heart and soul level.
But even with that, it's like obvious. I understand that sort of reasoning there for sort of people my age, people maybe above like 13 or so. But in terms of sort of younger kids, they're usually a case of being bullied and bullying. Is there sort of a link there with mental health, or is it just a case of a kid bullying another kid and nothing being done?
Oh, I mean, any sort of bullying or rejection, anything like that is going to leave some what I call internal injuries. I tend to stay away from words like wounds, because a lot of times, because I work with a lot of men and we just don't want to acknowledge wounds. But if you tell us, yeah, we got these internal injuries, we could be more accepting of that and willing to kind of look at them. So yeah, for bullying. So for example, when I was in fourth grade, I was bullied on the first day of school in a new school, and it wasn't a devastating insult. It was just basically somebody that was making fun of how I looked. And so you look back, or I look back, and I realized it was just some stupid little insult that I received when I was probably 9 or 10 years old, right? But what I didn't know in the moment was that something in my brain created this protective room that said, okay, we're going to just basically hide in this room, because anytime that I'm the new person in a group, I'm going to get rejected again. And that was painful, and I don't want it to happen again. So it kind of changed the way I interacted. It made me more shy, more self-conscious, definitely reduced the amount of like social risk I would take. And again, I didn't even know it until later in life, when I started kind of trying to figure out, like, okay, why do I do the things I do now? Let me roll back the clock and see maybe what are the roots. So yeah. And on top of that, the research also shows that the things that happen to us or don't happen to us that should have from age 10 and before, a better way to say it would be before age 10, those are really the foundational roots of our current modern day struggles. So yeah, you're exactly right. The stuff that happens to us young can have a really big impact.
And with those, not just those sort of things that happen with us young, but throughout life, when we have, or when we become, or say if we are officially diagnosed as depressed or as having anxiety, what sort of physically on the inside is going on differently compared to someone that isn't depressed and doesn't have anxiety?
Yeah, great question. So depression is the easy one to explain on a more biological level. There are happy chemicals, dopamine, serotonin, things like that that are responsible for making us feel good. And there are things or movements, whether it's exercise or eating and things like that, that'll give us a spike of those chemicals. But even without those things, there's a healthy level that we're supposed to that our brains are supposed to maintain in order to just keep us in a relatively happy mood. So yeah, when depression hits, that word literally sounds like what it does. It depresses you, or presses you down, the real you, the person that you're meant to be, and just presses you down to where you just kind of lack the drive that you normally have. And so yeah, it ends up being this chemical imbalance most of the time. With anxiety, it's a constant remaining in a fight, flight, or freeze mode. So your body is perceiving these threats that might be threats, but not the kind of threats that are literally going to kill you. And it's doing it because it's trying to help you out. It's trying to be your friend. And so it's creating these uncomfortable symptoms that we talked about earlier. And that anxiety is trying to create those symptoms so you can look and see, like, okay, here's the threat we're perceiving, check it out. Here's some stuff underneath the hood that threat is kind of highlighting. But regardless, it's kind of staying in that, do I need to fight this threat? Do I need to run away from it? Do I need to freeze so the threat doesn't see me? I tell people, if you were walking in the woods and you came across a bear, your body would absolutely go into fight, flight, or freeze mode because that's a threat. And so we need that reaction in our body. The problem happens is with anxiety, the body is working too hard and perceiving too many things as a bear, so to speak.
Yeah, so because you spoke there about there's a level of sort of the sort of dopamine and happy chemicals, or whatever you want to call them, that our brain should almost be at. So can you get to a point where you have too much dopamine, and does that also lead to depression or anxiety, or does that just sort of lead you into a bit of a in fairyland or whatever?
That's a great question. I don't know that I've ever met anybody or read any research about if chemicals are too high. I'd have to look into that. I guess there are conditions where someone can go into manic modes, but I haven't seen studies on what that means about those happy chemicals. That's a good question though.
Okay. I want to sort of move on to sort of relationships, because you've done actually not well. Before I saw that, you have a TikTok account, Rugged Counseling. I actually came across the TikTok account weirdly after I asked you to come on.
Oh really?
So I came across, I think it was your YouTube channel. No, it was your podcast I came across, because I watched some of your things on anxiety. Then I found out that you had a TikTok, and I was like, whoa, this guy's big on TikTok as well. This is big. And I checked out some of your sort of videos on TikTok. What was you thinking about that, of hopping onto TikTok and talking about mental health?
Yeah, so I said earlier that I am not, I don't like to talk, I like to listen. And so I know that surprises people when they see me on these videos, because I'm the only one in the video. But it started when two separate friends, one named Peter, another named Greg, they both said, hey, you need to get on TikTok. It's growing and you could help a lot of people if you got on there. And I resisted for a while. I was like, I'm not doing that. I came up with a whole bunch of excuses. But they kept throwing it out there, and they said, yeah, just throw out some mental health tips and help some people, because they know I like to help people. So I did, and didn't have a clue as to what I was doing as far as like what was what would work, what was appealing, what the background should be, any of that stuff. I just said, all right, I'll throw it out there and see what happens. But sure enough, it tended to help people. So I did another one a couple weeks later, and that helped a few people as well, and just kind of grew from there.
I know, yeah. I mean, it's pretty big now, isn't it? It's got like, how many followers have you got? Do you know?
It's somewhere in the 120,000 range, something like that.
Mental,
So it's
absolutely mental. That's amazing. And I do shout out to Peter and Greg, because I'm sure you've helped. I mean, I'm sure you've helped all those hundreds of thousands in some way. But in particular, I know I mentioned relationship before. The reason why is because a lot of your sort of more popular videos, even though loads of them get thousands and thousands of views, or some of your more popular videos are to do with relationships. And I've always been of the opinion, and this has been quite controversial with my friends, but I've always been of the opinion that we probably mature, like fully mature, probably at around, let's say 22, 23, a lot later than people think. Okay. That's my opinion, also based on some science as well. And that I think that you shouldn't get into a relationship until you at least are at the age of going to university or college or whatever. That you should wait a lot longer, because the damage that some of my friends have had to face because of being in a relationship, whether it's an abusive, emotionally or physically, or whether it's just the constant going in, getting out, going in, getting out, doesn't help. So I want to just ask you a question about sort of relationships. What are your opinions on relationships, particularly young relationships, and not just the damage impact on mental health, but maybe even in general as well?
Yeah, I love your thinking on that. I mean, we see the divorce rates, and they're just horrific. So we've got to do something. So yeah, I think in what I try to never make a hard and fast rule about, like, all right, this is the age that I think somebody should start dating, because everybody just grows up in such a different environment. In this current environment, yeah, I think in this current culture, with, like you said, the brain developing later, I think even the most up-to-date research I've seen on men's brains is that 25 is when our brains fully develop. So, so I think, yeah, if people would wait, it would definitely let them mature some. However, I will also say that there is growth that can come from being in a relationship that you can't get out of one. So that's where I see in both sides of this. But if you force me to give an answer, yeah, I think waiting is definitely better, but waiting by itself isn't going to help, because if all you're doing is living a life with not any challenge, living a life where there is no hard season, there are no hard seasons, then you're really not maturing. You're just getting older. And of course, there is some brain development happening. But if you look back at previous generations, they were getting married at 18, 19, 20, and that was the norm. And their divorce rates were much lower than we have now. So I think part of it is that we don't ask much of ourselves in the younger years, in the teenage years. And so therefore it kind of keeps us in a less mature phase. And so, yeah, if we're going to stay mature longer, we're going to stay immature longer, then we also should wait on a relationship. But if you could choose to live a life that's kind of countercultural, where you're purposely putting yourself into challenging things and hard situations, then you actually could maybe speed up your maturity clock, and then be more ready as a whole person, ready to give themselves to another person.
Yeah, like I completely understand that. Obviously, in general, it is subjective. It all depends on the person and whatever. And I've got friends that from 14 are still in relationships at 19, which is mental. Like, and I've also got friends that have been in countless, awful relationships. I mean, that was just sort of my opinion, is that you should just wait later. I think my follow-up question to that is, in terms of sort of young relationships, and I know I'm sort of pressing hard at this, what sort of advice would you sort of give in order to be in a young relationship? So let's say 19, 20, because that's my age, and be in a thriving one, which also allows both of you to mature rather than stay immature, if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah. So you're asking how to make the relationship successful when you're already in it, or are you asking how to be ready to be in a healthy relationship? 'Cause those
I
are two
think a bit of
different
both.
things.
If first we focus on when you're already in it, and then how to almost know when you're ready to be in it
Okay, yeah,
or in one.
yeah. So if you're already in it, my immediate advice is become a very, very, very good listener, because in any kind of a conflict, if our main goal is to get our point, if my main goal is to get my point across to you, then I'm really not prioritizing listening to you and understanding what you're saying. I'm just trying to make sure you hear what I'm saying. And if you're not prioritizing listening to me, all you're trying to do is get me to understand what you're saying. So it becomes this just conflict and nothing actually gets solved. So then, well, maybe this isn't the right one. Maybe I need to find somebody else, because we can't resolve any of these arguments, right? And we start getting resentment and it just blows up. But if we would learn simple skills of listening, then we don't have to agree with the person in the conflict, but we could at least start to understand them better, start to empathize with them better. And I think that would go a long way. That's just a basic skill level thing. But that takes humility, and that takes maturity to be able to say, like, okay, I'm gonna lay down my point for 5 minutes and not try to drive it home. And I'm just gonna sit here and listen to what he or she is saying. And I'm gonna try to like put what they said in my own words and say it back to see if I'm actually getting what they said. That alone would solve like 90% of the arguments that couples have. Also, I would say, and um, tends to be a unpopular one, but the longer you can delay physical affection, the better, because the physical affection creates all of those chemicals like oxytocin, vasopressin, norepinephrine. Those chemicals get attached to that other person when you get physical. And so if those chemicals get attached before you really know them, their heart, their soul, their mind, then it's harder to really be objective about who they are, and if this is a relationship that you want to stay in. Because if you're already getting the physical, I mean, it feels awesome, and I'm going to overlook a whole lot of potential red flags in order to keep getting the physical. So those are just a couple of thoughts for when you're in the relationship.
And what about when do you sort of know when you're ready to be in one? Almost, but if you're someone, like me, for example, someone that I want to focus on myself, I want to mature as much as possible, and then find someone. At what point do you sort of? I know, again, it's a broad statement, but at what point do you think is a good point where, now's the time? How do you know?
Yeah, man, that's a great one. And I'll try to give just some broad overview types of thoughts. One of them is there's this myth that if I could just find the right person, then I'll have a good relationship. But that's just not the case. You have to become the right person. So with that mindset, and that takes a while to actually get there. You can sort of mentally assent to that, like, yeah, I want to become the right person. I'm not going to worry about it as much about finding the right person. But getting it up here in your head is different than really getting it down deep in your heart and soul. So becoming the right person, and at that point, it looks like, having wise people that are older than you in your circle of life, and just asking them, like, hey, what do you see in me? What are some areas that are already strong that I need to continue to take advantage of? And what are some areas that I need to really mature in? What tendencies do you see in me that are going to be helpful in a relationship? And then what traits do I need to really watch because these can be relationship killers? Because it's hard to be objective with ourselves. We tend to either beat ourselves up in areas that maybe we're too harsh on ourselves, but then we also tend to ignore areas, whether it's on purpose or just because we can't see them, areas that really do need work. So having those people, those older wise people, can help a lot. But also, I think if a general pattern of your thoughts is, what can I get? How can I make myself happy? If they're mostly selfish in pattern, then that's probably an indication that it's not quite time for a relationship. Because again, a relationship, at the core, it's like, I've heard it said, love is basically inconveniencing myself to benefit somebody else, or whatever word you want to put on that, inconveniencing or laying myself down for somebody else's benefit. So if I'm still in the mode of like I'm wanting to advance my career or whatever kind of self-driven goals I have, that's fine, but don't try to throw a relationship onto that, because the relationship is going to require that you actually lay yourself down and give yourself to that person.
Yeah, I think it's quite hard because let's say you're someone that sort of wants to work on yourself, you're prioritizing yourself, you want to make yourself happy, you want to mature to the max, etc., etc. But then now all of a sudden to go into the mindset of, well, now I'm going to lay myself down for someone else. It's like you're going from one extreme to the other, and I think that's where it's hard. And I think that's why when people get sort of a little bit older or whatever, before they get to the point of where they've spent years and years and years of just sort of working on themselves, just before that point they enter a relationship, and then whilst they're in the relationship they carry on working with themselves and carry on working with others. I mean, that's sort of my thinking on it. You mentioned the phrase red flags, which is sort of often mentioned on social media, and everyone goes, so and so is a red flag, this is a red flag, that's a red flag. What would you sort of say are red flags in relationships which aren't usually sort of spotted or seen, at the beginning, earlier on? What red flags would you say should be noticed?
Yeah,
I guess.
great question. I'll start with the first one that also ties into your previous question. One of the things that you can realize if you're in a good spot to be in a relationship is if you feel like you are a whole, satisfied individual who doesn't need someone to be okay. That's a pretty good indication that, okay, yeah, I'm to the point where I can enter into a healthy relationship. Because most of the time people enter into relationships being not whole, not complete, and thinking the other person is going to help them feel okay or help them be happy. If we are depending on somebody else to make us happy, some other person, that's a dangerous game, because then I'm trying to take from them, they're trying to take from me, and I don't even have much to give anyway. They don't have much to give anyway, so it's like we're both taking, and eventually we both just run out of supply. So if we can get to that point where we're whole and are giving of ourselves out of an overflow, then that's a pretty good indication that we're in a healthy spot. So you flip that as far as the red flag thing you just asked about. If you notice someone or yourself, I always try to, like, when I talk red flags, I try to couch it as far as, yeah, the other person might have some red flags, but so do you. So let's be fair on both sides. So if either you or the other person, it tends to project some neediness, like if you don't respond to a text or a call for a few hours, what kind of reaction do you get from that? How do they respond when they don't get their way? Could be something as simple as like what restaurant you choose, or if it's a certain night of the week that they were wanting to do something but it didn't work out, so it had to be a different night. Just little things. How do they roll with the punches when things don't go their way, or do they tend to get sensitive and maybe even defensive about it when things don't go their way? Another early sign to sort of see somebody's character is how do they treat the waiters and waitresses at a restaurant, because how they treat service staff is eventually how they're going to treat you. Because if they are rude to service staff, then it indicates that they have a pretty self-absorbed mindset, and they think they're better than whoever that person serving the table is. And so eventually, once they're comfortable enough with you, you will, in their minds, just become another person that they think they're better than and can boss around and mistreat. Those are a few things off the top of my head, but yeah, we can keep going back and forth with it too.
No, I always, that last one's really I've always sort of valued, not especially in terms of friends. Like if my friends are rude to waiters or waitresses, or just sort of any sort of service staff, I immediately would just never go out with them again. That sort of even with family as well. Like I personally make it a sort of I personally believe that it's my responsibility to make sure that I leave the table in a way that sort of I would like it to be if I was a waiter. And I have technically been a waiter in the past as well. So like I know what it's like. And I always think it's so I just think it says so much about someone when they treat particularly waiters and waitresses in that sort of way. And I think that's probably one of the biggest and most obvious red flags that you could ever get. Because like you said, if they're going to treat them like that, they're going to end up treating you like that one day.
Right.
I want to also ask you about because you made so I in the last week or so have been commenting on some of your videos, asking people if they've got any sort of questions that they'd like me to ask you. One of the things that someone wanted me to ask you about was about love addiction, right? And you've sort of made a TikTok about that. Could you sort of explain what love addiction is and maybe give us a bit more of an insight on the subject?
Sure. So I'll start by saying it is a term that counselors and therapists use a lot, and it's also not an officially diagnosable term. There are plenty of those that we use in therapy sessions that don't have a specific diagnostic code to them. So I'll start by saying that we use the word addiction with it, but it wouldn't be to the level of a clinical addiction. It would be, if you really wanted to parse words, it would be more of a dependence. But in layman's terms, what it is somebody who's addicted or only interested in the beginning stages of a relationship, those just head over heel feelings, that just fresh new feeling of euphoria, like, oh, this person's so awesome and it's great, and like it's real and it's amazing. The problem comes is someone who's into that sort of love addiction umbrella is they can only get to that point of the story, and they can't start developing those deeper attachments, those more long-term attachments. And after that newness wears off, either they do something to sabotage the relationship, or they find some reason in the other person to end the relationship, and then they just go start the whole process over with somebody new. And it's hard to see it in the moment when somebody's doing it, but if you look back with them over their timeline over the last however many years, if you start seeing like, okay, so almost every relationship you've had in the last 3 years has gone basically to this 2 to 3 month point and then stopped. So what's up with that? It may not be anything, but it's at least worth looking into. What you find is that people that are in that pattern, that cycle, is that they're trying to find the whole world in one lover, one partner. And that's just not realistic. One person is not going to be able to bring every quality and every need that you have and meet those needs. So it's an unrealistic expectation of that other person to meet all their needs, to be everything in life that they want. And I'll say this too, movies and love songs, they are not our friends with this one, because so many of those songs, like, they sound great. The concept of that kind of love is, I mean, it just ideally sounds awesome, but wait, like, I can't breathe without you. How do I live without you? Like, you're my everything. You complete me. Like, if you actually had somebody say those kinds of things to you in a conversation, like, it would sound good at first, but then you realize, like, oh my gosh, that's a heavy burden for me to carry. I can't be like the everything for this person.
That person's a weirdo. If someone starts saying that to you, like, this person's a stalker, obsessed.
Right. And so most people, and most people that are in the love addiction pattern, they don't say those things, but they have those things going on inside them. And it just becomes this internally toxic pattern of new relationship, and then every one of them ends on a negative note for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean, that's what sort of one person, like I said, wanted me to ask you more about this sort of feeling. You mentioned because you spoke there about if you look back at yourself and you notice that every relationship of yours lasts 2 or 3 months. Could it also be possible where it's not 2 or 3 months, it's literally just 2 or 3 weeks, it's not really a relationship, you're in that sort of before relationship stage, and you're always getting those? Is that an example of almost love addiction as well, where you're always getting to those beginning stages and just before you're in a relationship, you cut it off, finished, and it keeps on happening? Is that potentially love addiction?
It could be. I mean, it with that short of a time frame, sometimes it's hard for those euphoric brain chemicals to really come up enough.
Or are
But
they just looking for someone, essentially?
I think, yeah, it could be a levitation thing, could be looking for someone, but it also sometimes lately with the advent of dating apps, it has kind of conditioned us to not commit, just like keep our options open, keep playing the field. And so, yeah, I'll date you for a couple of weeks, but then I'll move to somebody else to see if they're who I want. So it's almost like you're maybe holding back more than diving fully in. A love addict is really going to like dive in head over heels for you specifically, and then back away. Sometimes if it's a 2 to 3 week thing, that may be more of an indication of like I'm kind of commitment averse. But again, I'm making generalizations here.
Yeah, no, of course, yeah. How do you not, and this sort of common question that a lot of people ask is, how do you stop yourself from getting attached to someone before you're essentially in a relationship? Because you spoke there about how you meet someone, and then the beginning stage is always good, you're talking to each other, you're smiling, blah 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 blah, and then the other person's not interested, and then you're essentially heartbroken even though you were never actually in a relationship. How do you stop yourself from getting attached to someone else?
That's a tricky one, because you do want to get attached, right? If you go too far in that direction of like, I don't want to get attached, then yeah, you just keep your heart on the sideline. And at the same time, you don't want to get attached too quickly. So there has to be a nice middle ground in there somewhere. And I'm purposely not using the word balance, because I really don't believe that balance is an attainable goal. Like life is just too change oriented to always be balanced. I tend to look at it like a symphony, where it isn't every single instrument playing all the time. It's just at different parts of the symphony. There are, yeah, a ton of instruments at once, or maybe for a few minutes there's a few instruments. So that's kind of how I try to tell people with something like this, is that don't go all or nothing, and also there's no perfect balance. But how to not get attached too quickly, that ultimately comes down to knowing who you are. If I know who I am, and I'm already a satisfied person, and I'm in a good place, and I don't feel needy, like I would like somebody, but I don't need somebody to be okay, then usually you're not going to get attached too quickly. And you're also in a place where like I can also get attached. So I think you got to look inward to think, okay, am I at a good place just with my own identity and my own needs of significance and attention being met?
Yeah, I think a lot of the sort of things that we've talked about throughout the podcast seems to be sort of heavily involved in sort of knowing who you are and being confident in who you are, believing in yourself, and understanding that you yourself are completely fine. And but then if you need, other people are almost an addition. And when you find that person, then you're willing to sort of lay yourself down. But
Yes.
before that, you've got to sort of work on yourself throughout. I just want to quickly talk about two more sort of topics. The first one is just quickly talk about it is
I got plenty of
parent
time,
wounds.
so yeah, bring it.
Oh, brilliant. So parent wounds, right? You earlier on mentioned your dad, your granddad, and then you also mentioned your mum with the blanket. So you quite clearly have a good relationship, or I would assume you have a good relationship with your parents when you were younger. Now, not everyone obviously has that. And one of the other sort of questions that people asked me was when I put it on my Instagram was about sort of parent wounds, essentially. I mean, I know that's how you called it. They essentially called it not having a good relationship with their parents. Could you tell us more about that, the impacts that can have, and how to almost overcome the impact of a mother wound or a father wound? Because you always hear the terms, I can't remember what they're called specifically, but when like someone will say something and then someone else of the opposite gender will respond, or do you have mummy issues or daddy issues? Yeah. And
Yes,
obviously sometimes
yes.
you can use it as a joke, but sometimes it's true that they could almost have mum or dad issues.
Yes, it's I hate the term mommy issues or daddy issues, because it's so insulting. However, you're right, it does point to a reality. It's just we need to use more respectful terms about it. So yeah, I use mother and father wounds. Yeah, other people that aren't familiar with that language, they'll say, yeah, just stuff that we should have gotten, our parents should have done better when we were younger, whatever. The big point I try to get across to people is that no parent is perfect. So whether it was a good relationship with your parents or a bad one, the imperfections are in all of us. And so since nobody's perfect, they're gonna cause damage on accident. Sometimes they did it on purpose, but a lot of times people, if I'll give an example, there are so many times if I'm working with a client and they're trying to understand why they're doing the things they're doing in the present moment. Let's say they're 30 years old. What we were able to do is trace it all the way back to those first years that they can remember, like usually some 4 years old all the way through 10. And we start realizing that, okay, there were patterns that were already happening back then that are continuing to this day at 30. And sometimes people are unwilling to admit that, oh my gosh, wait, I have to say that my mom or my dad wasn't perfect, and they did things that actually affected me negatively, or they didn't do things they should have that also affected me negatively. So a lot of times it's hard to just like admit that, especially if the parents are no longer living, because it feels disrespectful and dishonoring to them. Other people, if you flip the other coin, is that they've got big time bitterness toward one of the parents, one or both, and they definitely understand the things that were negative and harbor a whole lot of hatred toward them. Those emotions toward the parent, those hold us back equally as much as the wounds that the parent put into us. So sometimes we tend to, I don't know, blame too much of what happened to us on the parent. So for example, there was a guy who just from a very young age, his dad was not involved. His dad worked too much. He was still married to his mom and they lived under the same house, but the dad just wasn't involved verbally, never hugged him, just worked and provided. So this guy growing up never really had a dad. And so all through the adult years, he realized like, oh yeah, my dad was never around. He was always working. But then later in life, when his dad was in his 70s, this guy realized like, oh, I didn't know that when my dad's dad, well, I'm getting my pronouns mixed up. When my dad was young, his dad totally abandoned the family and just left the dad with no means of financial support. So my dad way back then as a kid decided like, all right, my kids are never going to go without a solid financial foundation. So he started to understand his own dad's patterns of being a workaholic because of what his dad did to him. So it becomes this generational pattern where we start to see like, yes, our parent messed up either on purpose or on accident. But I also understand like both can be true. Yes, they messed up. And I see where that came from because other stuff happened to us, other stuff happened to them and to their parents. And you can keep on going. The things that, those internal injuries that I talk about, we react to those, whether positively or negatively, and we treat people differently because of those internal injuries. So bring it back to your question of how do you know kind of what you've got going on in there? There are these questions that we have deep down in our soul, and we don't know what words to put to them. Like we don't use this language when we're little, but one of the basic ones is we need to know, like, am I loved? Like, do you actually love me? And the parents should be saying it. They should be physically affectionate with them. That should be playful. All those things to keep giving that message, driving that message home of you are loved. I love you. You don't have to perform for this love, no matter what. You are loved. Other things, am I safe? And because kids, obviously, we need protection. And so if a parent, God forbid, is abusive, then not only does that not answer the question in the affirmative, it answers it in the negative. Of no, I'm not safe, and I'm not even safe around the one or two people in the world that I should be safe around. So that can cause massive amounts of trauma on those young years. Other ones, men especially, need to know, what, do I have what it takes to become a man? Like I see my dad, he's a real man. And so like, do I have what it takes to be there someday? Like, I'm on the right track. Girls, again, I'm making generalizations here, but so many girls will dress up in, ballerina outfits or princess outfits, and they'll come running to their dad or their mom like, "Hey, do you see me? Do you see me?" They want to be seen. They want to be noticed. They want to have this sense of beauty. So yeah, the parents should be the ones that are answering those questions. There's so many more, but those are some of the more common ones. So if we look back at our story and we realize like, okay, so my parents did an awesome job in like 99 out of 100 areas. And here's one area that like, okay, I didn't get what would have been ideal. So what do I do with that? Or my parents did terrible jobs, or so many of them. This was one comment I noticed in those parent wounds videos. So many parents just weren't even around, period. Like I never knew my dad, I never knew my mom. So yeah, that's a common one as well. And it's so sad because the questions weren't answered. And so the assumption that the kid makes is that, well, no, I'm not really loved and I'm not really valued. So yeah, it's such a broad topic, and it's a broad enough topic where I'll be doing some more in-depth information with it, whether it's through videos or podcast episodes, but that's kind of at least the broad overview of it.
Yeah, I would definitely be interested in that because it is a very interesting topic. Do you, we really earlier on, we spoke about sort of the increasing divorce rates. And unfortunately, sometimes when you have those divorces, one parent ends up essentially not being there anymore. Do you think we're going to have an increase of parent wounds now because of the increasing divorce rate? And what impact do you think that's going to have on society in general and on the individual?
Yeah, you already see it. I mean, I don't know how long the divorce rate has been around 50% or at least 50% in the US. It's been, I want to say, at least 20 years. So that's been enough time to see that generation of kids come through the teenage years. And for example, there's just, number one, the divorce causes trauma, not to mention any other parent wounds, whether the parents were still together or not. But divorce is a major trauma. And so you can see it. One of the biggest ways you see it is hyperactivity in guys in those teenage years. ADHD is one thing, but a lot of times somebody who's really hyper is really just trying to get attention, and they'll settle for negative attention if somebody just pays attention to them. And a lot of times that comes from that wound of divorce because they felt abandoned, they felt unseen. And so of course they're not purposely like strategizing this out to where like, all right, I'm going to be hyper so I get more attention. It's just like you just see more of that, and you notice, okay, that's a very most often, and again, I'm generalizing, most often when you see that really, really uncontrollable hyperactivity, it's somebody that's coming from a divorced home.
I want to give you a scenario, right? And the scenario is you have two people, you know for a fact that, you have three people, you know for a fact that this is true. Another therapist that's fully licensed has said one of them is definitely depressed, the other one is definitely got anxiety, and the other one sort of struggles with mental health but doesn't have either or, right? That all three of them have this. And you can't send them off to therapy, but you've got to give them some sort of recommendations to help them sort of improve their mental health, all three of them. And you can give different ones to each. What would be your sort of recommendations to them? Again, they can't go to therapy. And I don't know, again, to be fair, I'm sure it's even worse in America, actually, how expensive therapy is sometimes. Particularly, in the UK, we have a universal healthcare system, the NHS. But if you go on the NHS and you want to get therapy, you're not getting therapy for years and years and years. It's so long, the list. Yeah, it's crazy. And so instead, you got to go private, which ends up costing a lot. And expect, obviously, so the demand is high, so obviously it's going to be more, and it's a personal thing. I completely get it. But not everyone has the means to therapy. So what advice would you give to all three of them?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to do the rare thing of lumping them all together in this case. And before I do that, I will say, in this country, at least, yes, some therapy options are expensive, and at the same time, if you have insurance, a lot of times the copay is pretty low, $20 to $30. But if you have neither of those, whether it's access to a private practice therapist or even insurance, there are community mental health centers across the country that are usually within driving distance that are completely free, and you can get help through that. Also, folks in private practice, we do pro bono clients. In other words, we have a few spots in our schedule that we purposely keep open to do free work with people that can't afford it. So I'll say that just so people know that there is hope, just if they've got it in their head that they can't afford it. But if there truly is no way to get them to a therapist, here are a few ideas. So number one, finding other people to really be in deep relationship with, people you trust that are your own age, and also people you trust that are older than you, both, but your own age. They can help you just know that, all right, I'm not alone in this. I've got people that are standing shoulder to shoulder with me, that they know exactly what I'm going through and what my stage of life entails. The older folks can do that and more. They can tell you, hey, I understand where you are, because, hey, here's a story of how I made it through something tough. And they can give you a perspective on life that makes the things that we tend to worry about and get down about, they don't minimize them, but they just put them in a broader perspective. Let me see if I can find like a object here. So I'll just use my phone, for example. So if this is a scenario that I'm really worried about, this phone is representing the scenario. It's like,
so for
right
audio listeners, TJ's got his phone straight, like right close to his face.
Yes, thank you for yes. All right, so I'll do a little play-by-play with audio too. So the thing I'm struggling with is like taking up most of my vision. It's right in front of my face. But if I can talk to people who have been through this stuff before and they've been through life in general, I can start to get a bigger perspective. And so I can kind of zoom out. And as I'm saying this, I'm pulling the phone away from my face to where, okay, I still see this struggle. The struggle is still there, but it's not as big. It doesn't seem as big and heavy as it used to, because the people in my life have helped me see a bigger picture in life. Now, people are essential. We got to be connected. So that's one level of it. But we've got to do the courageous, and I say it's courageous because it's scary, but the courageous work of turning inside and figuring out, like, okay, what's the junk in here? And going way back to one of the earlier questions about why people don't go to therapy, I think the biggest one is we don't want to confront the junk. We don't want to confront those wounds, those messages that came to us early on in life, because they're painful and they're scary, and that I just don't want to deal with them. So I'm just going to keep them buried. And whether I have a therapist or not, part of my just daily routine is, all right, I'm going to look inward at least for a couple minutes and just see, like, okay, what's going on underneath the hood. I did a video on these messages inside of us where I used cement, and the point is, when we're young, our brains are really malleable. It's called neuroplasticity. And so those first 10 years of life are the most formative years for our brains. So we get good things, obviously, but some bad things happen, some things that shouldn't have happened, they should have happened, they didn't. So all that stuff becomes junk in our cement. And as our brain gets older, the brain gets harder to change, and therefore harder. And so those messages get kind of harder and harder to get out of there. They can come out. And so here's a few ways to deal with them once you've done that courageous work of looking inward to see that junk. Number one, meditation. Meditation is both underrated and overrated. And I say that because it's underrated because it's so, I don't know, it's a word that's so common these days, but if you survey people, you find very few people actually do it. We all know about it, but most of us are so busy and so stuck in our routines, we don't take the time to do it. But before there was ever even such thing as therapists, I mean, therapists are less than 100 years old as a field, as an official field. So before we were ever even around, meditation was really what people relied on to maintain their mental health. And so I think purposely carving out time each day to really just be still, and whether it's, there's all kinds of different ways to do it, but the brain knows how to repair itself. And if you give it that time and space to do it, it really can make a whole lot of progress. So meditation is just one thing. I'll pause there for anything you might want to add in before I keep going.
No, I've got nothing to add. I'm just interested in hearing sort of the sort of tips. Meditation is, like you said, is quite an interesting one. Because we, like you said, we all know about it. I know about it. I've always told myself I want to start yoga. I've said it for about a year. Still haven't started it. Never even done it in my life. Right? Because you have to have the act of just starting it. So it's something that I keep telling myself, start yoga, Tarek, just start it. 5 minutes a day, that's it. And I just never do it, even though we all know the incredible benefits of it. And I think it's also because we don't like the idea of sitting still for 5 minutes and not having anything. Like, how many times in the day do we have nothing going on? It's only when we're asleep that there's nothing going on. And even then, so our brain is still working. Like, just to shut down our brain almost for a bit. I don't think anyone likes that idea.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's a scary thing because we're not used to it. And again, it's scary because we know deep down that there's junk in there. There's those messages in there that we try to keep buried. So if we just like stay busy or stay high or drunk or whatever, whatever we choose to sort of numb out or escape, the idea of actually being still with my thoughts, that can be really scary. But man, that's the path to freedom. It's the path out of the woods. It's so common in life that the things that are most worthwhile are also the things that take the most effort. But so meditation is one of them. Journaling is incredibly healing. And when I say journaling, that's another one that people think, whatever, like I'm not going to take the time to do it. And I get it. I have to force myself to do it as well. And I don't do it every day, but it's a way of just emptying out the trash. We wouldn't drive our car around for hundreds of thousands of miles and not get an oil change. And so journaling is kind of like an oil change for the brain. It's what I call therapy as well. But in this case, journaling is so powerful because what happens is like the things we struggle with, whether it's anxiety, depression, or kind of that middle ground, like you mentioned, it's those negative emotions, those negative body sensations. And if we just try to like cut those off at the surface, in other words, if I just try to get rid of the symptoms, I'm leaving the root. And so journaling, it helps me get to the root because so often the back of the brain, the middle and the back of the brain is where the roots of anxiety and depression are living. And just talking about it can be helpful, but it's not going to be as thorough as really writing it out in a way. And there are steps to do in journaling. There's not one way to do it. There are plenty of ways to structure your journals, and they don't have to take more than 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but it accesses that subconscious part of the brain where the anxiety and depression really live. So other ways, exercise, I'm a huge proponent of that. The research shows that if we can do it 4 times a week for 30 minutes at a time, it can have the same effect as an antidepressant or anti-anxiety med. Getting our sleep under control is a huge one. Now, sometimes the very main symptom we're struggling with is a lack of sleep, which I get, but if whatever you can control about sleep is also going to help. And then eating. There's just more and more research coming out about that connection between our stomach and our brain. And whatever we're putting in our stomach is really the fuel, the gasoline that the brain is going to be using to deal with the hard stuff of life. So if we're not giving it enough good stuff, or if we're giving it too much, sugar or whatever, it just simply won't have what it needs to process the challenges of life.
When you said eating, that is my favorite thing in the world. So I'm going to quickly ask you a question. Are there such things? So we know that sort of having too much sugary foods, etc., can be quite bad for you mentally. Are there such things as sort of brain foods that sort of help you mentally, or mental foods or whatever, that are really good for that sort of thing?
Sure. And I have to qualify this statement. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm also not a dietitian. So anything I'm passing along is just simply what I'm getting from them. But it's your standard antioxidant type of foods. The more colors, the better. So if it's, blueberries or, red peppers, yellow peppers, anything, fruits and vegetables that have colors, those are guaranteed to help your brain. Each person has a different body chemistry, so it's gonna differ as far as which foods are most effective. But those are my favorite tips to throw out there. Is just eat as many fruits and vegetables with as many a variety of colors as you can get.
Brilliant. Yeah. So well, that was meditation. What was the other one? Meditation,
Journaling.
journaling, exercise, food, sleep.
Yep. And then the people around you as well.
People around you. Forgot about that one. Yeah. The
Yeah.
importance of having people around you. I've just got one question and then just a quick final question.
Sure.
Let's say you're king of the world. You can do one thing. Everyone does it. What would that thing be?
Oh my goodness. I've never even thought about this question before. If I'm king of the world and everyone does it, man, I think if everyone considered, and how do I wrap this up in a answer that doesn't take 2 hours? Okay, if I'll go back to what I said early in the talk, is that
You didn't expect that question, did you?
exactly,
Just right
yeah,
at the end.
it's good. This is awesome. I love the curveball. So I mentioned story earlier, and if everybody could zoom out for a few minutes and realize that, okay, yes, my life is a story, and also I'm part of this larger story going on around me, this thing called life. And if we could consider, like, okay, what do I believe about this story? Like, what's going on? How do I fit into it? That can start to answer some of the questions that that we have to answer to really be fully alive. You know, who am I? Who am I connected to? Who should I be connected to? What's my purpose? If people could zoom out enough to start to see, okay, where do I fit into that? What do I believe? I think that can bring a whole lot of peace, joy, fulfillment, self-esteem, and those are the things we're really after. It's like, yeah, we talk about, like, I don't want to be anxious, or I don't want to be depressed. Well, what do we want? And so I think if we could zoom out and look at life as a big story that we've been placed into, that I think can really help a lot of folks.
A beautiful answer there, TJ. And just the last question that I always ask every single one of my guests right at the end: if you could give one piece of advice to young adults around 20 years old, what advice would that be?
Oh man, I love this. Okay, so the probably a third of the clients who come to see me in person are folks in their 20s. And what I've learned is that stage of life, I believe, is the hardest stage in life. Now, there are plenty of positives that are part of that stage of life, but I say it's the hardest because there's so much change happening all at once. So because it's such a season of change, the biggest advice I've got is to basically twofold. Number one, go easy on yourself. And number two, grieve it well. Here's what I mean by that. Go easy on yourself because for whatever reason, we have this tendency to beat ourselves up when we're struggling. And if we can just, like, be more objective and just observe our situation and observe how we're feeling, it actually helps it go away faster. But when we start beating ourselves up about it, it only increases. And then grieving, well, what I mean by that is that grief, of course, it happens when someone dies, but it also happens when there's a big loss in life or a big change. And those early 20s years, typically you're graduating from university, you are moving to a different city, you're moving out of your parents' house, whatever the life circumstances are that have changed, those are huge changes. And with those locational changes also comes, okay, my first job. I'm no longer dependent on someone else to provide income for me. The pressure's on me now. And along with some of those changes come, I'm no longer near the friends that I've had for years on end. So now I have this whole situation where there's new pressure on me financially. I don't have the people around me that I used to. I don't have the comfortable setting that I'm used to just being in. And then it goes back to those soul level questions of, oh shoot, do I have what it takes? Like, can I handle this challenge? And what if I fail? What does that mean about me? And all these questions that start to roll through our heads. So if we can go easier on ourselves because, hey, this is normal. It's a hard season of life, and grieve those things that have changed or been lost. If we grieve those things well, we're going to be paying attention to those deeper needs down there, and therefore make it through the season a little more peacefully.
And that's it for this week's episode of the Me, Myself, and Hopefully You podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. It was a really informative one. I was really excited to get TJ on, and I'm glad he took the time to come on. I appreciate it as well. And hopefully we can do another episode in the future as well. If you guys want it, then make sure you let me know down in the comments below, and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future episodes. Other than that, thank you so much for watching. Have a great week. Until next time.